U.S. Air Force retired, Executive Director of the Constitution Leadership Initiative, a program to promote a better understanding of U.S. history and the U.S. Constitution among American people. Previously, Gary acquired 40-plus years experience in defense studies, program management, analysis, training management, and military air operations. Gary is a regular teacher presenter for the FACE Lessons in Liberty. That's the Foundation for American Christian Education. And he also serves as a volunteer there. So, with that, I give you Gary.
Thank you, Diana and Waverly, for another opportunity to address you on an important topic. I was asked to speak about the President's War Powers. It's an arcane topic, nobody cares about it anymore, but I thought we'd just kind of have a resurgence of interest in that for some reason.
I think we have a big reason to.
That was a lame joke, so I'll give you.
Please use the mic, Karen.
Can't hear me?
Use the microphone, please.
I offered.
Just button on the bottom.
Oh, it's down here. Okay, sorry. Okay, I think it's on now.
Is that better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll give you a warning up front. We're not going to solve the dilemma over presidential war powers tonight. And there is indeed a dilemma, and it has been for 40, 50 years. But in his halfway through his second term as Vice President John Adams wrote a letter to Abigail, and he said, among other things, of course, great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. War, obviously, was very much in the minds of the founders, having just successfully completed the war against Britain, but still knowing that times were perilous. Britain and France were at their each throats once again, and could have drawn the United States into that very easily. So anyway, we're going to look at 1973 with great interest, when President Nixon was our president in his second term. He was very famous for later, after he resigned from the presidency, stating, "When the president does not, it means it's not illegal." And of course, there have been other presidents that have taken some similar tack to that. So we're going to talk about war tonight, and it's important to realize that war is viewed differently by different people. Clausewitz famously viewed war as a continuation of politics by other means. And yes, politics has many attributes as well. But war is obviously can be a way of prosecuting politics through another means. If you have a military background, you're going to recognize this acronym. Bottom line up front. Only Congress has the constitutional authority to declare war. We all know that, right? We've all read that. Many presidents since our first, George Washington, have committed U.S. troops to hostilities without a declaration of war. Congress has declared war on 11 different occasions in 5 different wars since 1812, the very first declaration of war asked for by James Madison. The Mexican-American War in 1846, Spanish-American War 1898, World War I, and then 3 times during World War II. A formal declaration of war, a formal declaration of war brings into effect numerous other federal statutes, as we're going to see, which is why it is very seldom evoked. The War Powers Act, 1973, is a big point of contention. We're going to talk about the 2 different views of that. Number 1, that it is entirely constitutional, and number 2, that it is entirely unconstitutional. There's no middle ground. You're either on one camp or the other on this issue. So Washington viewed it this way. if we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. It seems at odds with a Congress or a convention in 1787 that wrote into the Constitution that there would not be a standing army, that there would be only an army raised and then only for 2 years at a time when it was necessary. But Washington is saying it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. It's a little bit of a contradiction there. At the Constitutional Convention, we have a pretty good record of the discussions over the War Powers Act, or the War Powers in general, and the Congress's part of that, as well as the President's part of that. And there's not a shred of doubt that the framers intended the Commander-in-Chief power to allow the President to initiate only protective measures against sudden attack, not to initiate offensive military operations without a declaration of war. There's really no disputing that in the convention record. In Federalist 69, Alexander Hamilton stated, "The President will have only the occasional command of such part of the militia of the nation as by legislative provision may be called into the actual service of the Union." Madison, for his part, in 1792, wrote that war should not only be declared by the authority of the people, whose tolls and treasures are to support its burdens, instead of the government, which is to reap its fruits, but that each generation should be made to bear the burden of its own wars, instead of carrying them on at the expense of other generations. So there are many other views and comments in the convention record about this subject of what is the President's task and what is Congress's task in this complex equation we call war. But the bottom line is they certainly didn't see the President as being empowered to initiate hostilities, i.e. initiate war or make war. But, as I point out in the last bullet, much, as we know, has changed since 1787. There are 6 different types of war powers. First, obviously, there's the President's constitutional war powers. He is the Commander-in-Chief, and that's all the Constitution says about his war powers. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what that entails. He is the Commander-in-Chief, but obviously there must be more than that, than just being and having that title of Commander-in-Chief. There has to be more involved in that. We know the Congress's constitutional war powers. They have the power to declare war. They have the power to raise armies. They have the power to regulate armies. They have the power to call up these militias in the service of the country. They have a lot of different ways that they address the issue of war. We have treaties that are ratified from time to time by the Senate and which contain mutual defense clauses and obligations to come to each other's defense. That obviously entails and implies that there may be war associated with that. We have the War Powers Resolution of 1973. We'll talk about that in detail. We have authorizations for the use of military force. The very first one, 1792, Washington asked for an authorization to send troops out to western Pennsylvania to put down what was commonly called the Whiskey Rebellion. The very first authorization for the use of military force, and of course we still see them going on today. In fact, one still continues to be in effect today. So, just a few weeks ago, let me get my slides to advance, the President sent a letter to the Congress. He says, "Dear Mr. Speaker and Mr. President Pro Tem of the Senate, on the the night of June 21st, 2025, at my direction, the United States forces conducted a precision strike against 3 nuclear facilities in Iran used by the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran for its nuclear weapons development program. The strike was taken to advance vital United States national interests and in collective self-defense of our ally Israel by eliminating Iran's nuclear program. He goes on to state, the strike was limited in scope and purpose. The United States discreetly targeted 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Iranian troops and other military facilities were not targeted. No United States ground forces were used in the strike, and the mission was planned and executed in a manner designed to minimize casualties, deter future attacks, and limit the risk of the escalation. I directed this military action consistent with my responsibility to protect the United States citizens both at home and abroad, as well as in furtherance of United States national security and foreign policy interests. And I've highlighted this next sentence. I acted pursuant to my constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive, and pursuant to my constitutional authority to conduct United States foreign relations. Isn't that an interesting way to characterize this attack? Just continuing foreign relations. The United States took this necessary and proportionate action consistent with international law, and the United States stands ready to take further action as necessary and appropriate to address further threats or attacks. I am providing this report as part of my efforts to keep the Congress fully informed, consistent with the War Powers Resolution. I appreciate the support of the Congress in this action. You notice that Trump did not use the words pursuant to the War Powers Resolution, but rather consistent with the War Powers Resolution. In doing so, he follows the practice of presidents going back to Reagan and even earlier. So authorizations for use of military force, as I said, began in 1792 with George Washington and have continued since. President Adams asked for one. Jefferson did after already dispatching the Navy to the Mediterranean Sea. He comes to Congress and asks for an authorization to use them. President Madison, besides the War of 1812, in which he did ask for a declaration of war, he also sent the Navy to Algeria. President Monroe did. President Eisenhower in Formosa and the Middle East. President Johnson, of course, in Southeast Asia. We'll come back to that. The asterisks, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is what gave him his authorization to use military force. President Reagan in Lebanon. There's some other aspects of that we may talk about. George H.W. Bush in Iraq, 1991, and then, of course, the 9/11 attacks, 2001, and then Iraq again in 2002. So just a few, not an exhaustive list of all of the authorizations for the use of military force that Congress has provided. As we all know, 7 days after the 9/11 attacks, Congress had this authorization for military force all ready to go and signed, sealed, and delivered. Who says Congress can't act quickly when they need to? I think it's somewhat of a miracle, perhaps, even that it was only 7 days after the attack. This very lengthy and very voluminous document was ready to go. And despite the disastrous pullout in Afghanistan, the country where this AUMF was first targeted, and after it has launched the global war on terror, it is still in effect today. In fact, the global war on terror has become the PWT. What do you think PWT stands for? The Permanent War on Terror. That's what it appears to be. As long as there are terrorists around the world that intend us harm, I suspect that this AUMF will stay in effect for a long, long time. So let's look at the War Powers Act. which is the target of much controversy. Facsimile of the actual act is on the left of the screen, and you can easily download this from the web. Of course, we know what sparked it. It was President Nixon's use of forces in Cambodia and Laos, which was not authorized by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which caused much consternation, a lot of demonstrations across the United States against this particular act of the president. And work began very shortly thereafter. It would take 2 years to get it complete, but work began on something that they knew would be called the War Powers Resolution that would attempt to curtail the president's use of military forces. So the War Powers Act, Public Law 93-148, begins by stating the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief to introduce United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. Now let's pause there for a moment and take a look at that very first statement. The constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief are exercised only. What is Congress doing there?
Giving up their
I haven't heard it yet. What are they doing by saying the constitutional powers are exercised only pursuant to these three conditions?
Checks and balances. Checks and balances.
Limiting the president.
Perhaps, but even more fundamentally, what are they doing? Where do they get the idea that the Constitution? Where do they get the idea that the president has constitutional powers in the Constitution? Are they not putting themselves as the Supreme Court and interpreting the Constitution? Do you see this? The Constitution gives the President Commander-in-Chief powers. The Congress is saying that the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief are only to be exercised in these three conditions. Where do they get that? Is that in the Constitution? That the Commander-in-Chief power is only to be exercised in this certain way? No, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives them the authority to state that the Commander-in-Chief power can only be exercised in these three conditions. They have exceeded their powers as the legislative branch and become the judicial branch, in my view. So, that said, these three conditions are what Congress believes the President's constitutional Commander-in-Chief powers can only be used on. And it should be clear that on June 20th, when 7 B-2s went across Iran, that none of these three conditions existed.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Anybody argue with that? None of these three conditions existed on January 20th. And that should be then why we see the President saying he is acting pursuant to his foreign affairs powers,
That's a great-
foreign relations powers.
That's a great-
So he knows these three conditions do not exist, but he has to explain to the Congress what has prompted his action. So anyway, this is what the War Powers Resolution attempts to do. Throttle the President's Commander-in-Chief powers to just these three specific circumstances. Right? We're not going to, you can download the War Powers Act in its entirety. We're not going to go through it line by line. But I do want to point out these several important features. The WPR, and you're going to see War Powers Act and War Powers Resolution. In the House, it passed as a War Powers Resolution. In the Senate, it passed as a War Powers Act. So you're going to see it referred to by both titles. So it goes on to state that whenever United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities or into any situation described in subsection A, which I just outlined. So whenever United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities, or when these three conditions have been met, does anybody see any problem already with that?
Conflict.
Do the three conditions have to be met
No.
to introduce forces into
they
hostilities?
don't.
No, absolutely they do not. So the War Powers Resolution is immediately self-contradictory. It immediately contradicts its first premise, that there are only three conditions and no others that will allow the President to introduce forces into hostilities. Whenever the United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities, or into any situation described in subsection A of this section, the President shall, so long as such armed forces continue to be engaged in such hostilities or situation, report to the Congress periodically on the status of such hostilities or situation, as well as on the scope and duration of such hostilities or situation, but in no event shall he report to the Congress less often than once every 6 months. What does this foresee? How long does this foresee forces being employed?
6 months.
Or at least 6 months. Okay? But we're going to see that it contradicts itself yet again in just a moment. The President, in every possible instance, shall consult with Congress before introducing the United States Armed Forces into hostilities, or in situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and after every such introduction shall consult regularly with Congress until the United States Armed Forces are no longer engaged in hostilities or have been removed from such situations. And it finishes up by stating, nothing in this joint resolution is intended to alter the constitutional authority of the Congress or of the President. Really? You began by stating the constitutional authority of the President is here curtailed to just three circumstances, and now you're saying nothing in this resolution is intended to alter the constitutional authority of the Congress or of the President or the provision of existing treaties.
Schizophrenic.
So we're talking about contradictions, and they are manifold in this document. So nothing in this joint resolution is intended to alter the constitutional authority of the Congress or of the President or the provision of existing treaties, or shall be construed as granting any authority to the President with respect to the introduction of the United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations wherein involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, which authority he would not have had in the absence of this joint resolution. Got it? Clear?
Clear as mud.
Is that clear? Yeah. Well,
Clear as mud.
Yeah.
now, there are other requirements that we must attend to in the War Powers Resolution. As we've always stated, he has to notify Congress in writing within 48 hours of committing U.S. forces, and Trump did this. He must routinely consult with Congress until armed forces are no longer engaged in hostilities. He must terminate any use of United States Armed Forces within 60 days unless Congress has declared war or otherwise authorized continued use of those troops. And he must take no more than 30 days to withdraw those same troops unless Congress approves an extension. This is, in another phrase, is called a legislative veto. That is, Congress is reserving the right through a congressional resolution to order the President to withdraw troops that he has committed to hostilities.
Where's that in the Constitution?
Where is that in the Constitution? And in fact, the issue of legislative vetoes was settled by the Supreme Court in INS versus Chadha, and this, a lot of critics claim that this is a legislative veto in another guise. So there's all sorts of problems. Congress may order the President to remove such forces if they so direct by concurrent resolution. Is a concurrent resolution the law? No, a concurrent resolution is a concurrent resolution until it is signed by the President. Then it becomes law. Now, if the President vetoes this concurrent resolution, Congress can override his veto, as they did with the War Powers Act itself, when Nixon first vetoed it. Critics also charge that the entire War Powers Resolution violates the non-delegation doctrine. They are delegating to the president certain authorities through this resolution. That's a pretty weak charge because there's 20 or 30 different Supreme Court decisions regarding the non-delegation doctrine, and they have decided in almost every case that the delegation being criticized was entirely within Congress's authority. And yet none of the criticisms of the War Powers Resolution have ever been used to fabricate a case that has reached the Supreme Court. So nothing in the War Powers Resolution has been adjudicated. Not one word. And from my view, it will never be adjudicated because Congress likes the ambiguity that it gives.
Does that give a
their power.
constitutional crisis?
So, there's a lot of questions that the War Powers Resolution does not answer, either intentionally or through oversight. For instance, does deploying SEAL Team 6 or any special forces for that matter on a mission somewhere in the world require notifying Congress under the War Powers Resolution?
No.
In other words, how many soldiers does it take to trigger the notification of Congress? Sending one soldier into a hostile environment, does that trigger the War Powers Resolution?
It's not specific.
Doesn't say. So forces, American armed forces, is entirely undefined. Does it take a squad, a platoon, a company, a battalion, a brigade, whatever? What does it take? Forces are routinely deployed in many places of the world and are subject to hostile action without warning. Does this violate the War Powers Resolution if they're just deployed without the intent, overt intent, of engaging in hostilities? Does that trigger the War Powers Resolution? Is conducting offensive military action against another country considered conducting foreign affairs, as President Trump has alluded? Is the use of military force by the Commander-in-Chief part of his executive power that was vested to him in Section 1 of Article 2? The executive power is vested in one President of the United States. What does executive power mean? It's not defined. And over the years, there have been many cases where the court has attempted to put some definition, some form into that phrase, but not in the case of war powers. Is a declaration of war necessary for a country to be at war? Can this country be at war without a declaration of war? Does committing troops to a hostile situation overseas make us at war?
Definition.
Police action.
What is war? Now we go back to what is war? What is the threshold to call something being at war?
I do have a question. I know you talked about the Iran situation, but what about the deployment of the Marines in LA to help ICE?
That's later on.
That is an entirely different matter.
Yeah, war is with another country, not with yourself.
That is, in fact, there's other issues in terms of the Posse Comitatus Act,
That's right.
Yeah.
in terms of using armed forces to enforce the law. And then the final bullet, I just picked these out of the air, were the attacks on 9/11 by non-state terrorists, acts of war. Who can commit acts of war? Is it only a country, a nation, a state, or can individuals, or even a group of individuals,
That's not been defined either, right?
commit acts of war? So that's, you see how much is undefined by the War Powers Resolution.
I thought we went and bombed those people.
We did.
I mean, so wasn't that, weren't they from a state, a country?
Their attacks on 9/11 were considered to be acts of
Our
war.
government told
But the
us.
question is, can a gang of thugs
That live in a cave?
commit an act of war?
Who we are at war with.
And once again, it comes back to what is the definition of war? What is the threshold at which actions become war or remain something other than war?
The This all sounds
So you
meaningless.
see all the ambiguity and all the problems connected to the War Powers Resolution in question.
Well, let's jump back a little bit and see, we are in conflict. All right. Iran has supplied these terrorist groups with stuff. Before Trump was in office, we were protecting and bombing Yemen. We were sending people into hostile action. So that's been more than 6 months ago.
Oh yes, it's been years.
More than 30 days.
Yes.
Right? So we're doing all that. We're already gotten through the hostilities. So if we go back to what you said about the 30 days, 60 days, whatever it's like that, it was an ongoing conflict. The fact that Iran was supplying them, knowingly supplying them weapons, and they were attacking Israel, and also we were in Syria, and we were getting attacked. We've been in Iraq getting attacked since all this stuff. So this conflict's been going on for a long period of time, so is this just
Perpetual.
another step?
So the question is, all these terroristic attacks fall under the permanent war on terror
Right.
by the authorized by the AUMF of 2001. But there are other activities in there that probably fall outside the realm of the AUMF of 2001. And so there is, again, more gray area. Another question before I go on?
Do the emergency powers of the president clarify some of these issues, or do they make it more murky?
Where do you get the idea that the president has emergency powers?
Didn't Bush sign a executive order clarifying the emergency
Oh,
powers?
maybe I should rephrase it. Where do you find in the Constitution that the president has emergency powers?
Well, he kind of gave himself emergency.
Ah, yes. Many presidents have given themselves emergency powers and signed emergency executive orders, and that would be a topic for another discussion at some other future time. Because that is as complicated as this is tonight. Yes.
I just wonder, if we're at war with terror, maybe since Bush or whatever, what about something like Obama sending over so much money to Iran?
It's their money.
That's just foreign affairs.
Is that not treason?
That's just not foreign. Well, it's foreign affairs. It is foreign affairs being conducted by the president. Yes. Last question before I go on.
Thank you. In the most recent action, the president bombed the nuclear facilities. Since there was no declaration of war and we weren't consulted, does that constitute an act of war, and does war exist?
Hold that thought.
Or is it just a bunch of thugs at the top?
Hold that thought. I'll come to that. Okay. So Speaker Johnson is one of many people who has declared recently that the War Powers Resolution, or War Powers Act, as he states, this headline states, is unconstitutional. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. And as I said, I don't see this bubbling up to the top of Congress's legislative calendar anytime soon. So you can go out on the web, and through the right Google terms, you can find all sorts of essays that take both positions, or either position on this issue. You'll find essays that state the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional, like this one. The statute played a clear role in encouraging the terrorist attack that killed 241 Marines in 1983, and equally clearly encouraged Osama bin Laden to kill thousands of Americans on September 11, 2001. Similarly, unconstitutional usurpation of presidential power prevented our intelligence committee from preventing those attacks and dissuaded a key ally from sharing sensitive information that might also have prevented them. So that's just one of these essays, the War Powers Resolution at 40, still an unconstitutional, unnecessary, and unwise fraud that contributed directly to the 9/11 attacks by Robert F. Turner. Or the War Powers Resolution is constitutional. Given a narrow conception of the Commander-in-Chief power, that's a big preface there. The resolution, by limiting the president's use of force in hostilities without statutory authorization to 60 days, does not unconstitutionally infringe upon his power to make war. Okay? Read the rest of the essay by Bennett C. Rushkoff. The War Powers Resolution is still constitutional. The War Powers Resolution is not constitutional as an exercise of the war power, It is constitutional because it defines the war power. The War Powers Resolution is nothing more or less than a congressional definition of the word war in Article 1. It's an interesting take on this by Stephen L. Carter, University of Virginia Law Review. Recently, Senator Tim Kaine tried unsuccessfully to introduce legislation that would block any repeated attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. It failed on a mostly party line vote. John Fetterman crossed to vote against it. Rand Paul crossed the party line to vote in favor of it. But it failed nevertheless. In 2014, Senator Tim Kaine introduced legislation to repeal the War Powers Act. That again was turned down in the Senate by a 53-47 vote. But he keeps trying. How have some presidents obfuscated their war powers? Bill Clinton ignored the War Powers Resolution when he sent forces into Kosovo. He claimed because Congress had already funded and therefore implicitly approved the use of troops. Barack Obama insisted that handing off leadership of U.S. forces to NATO, as he did in Libya, eliminated the need for the War Powers Resolution because the Commander-in-Chief was not in charge of those forces, NATO was. It's very similar to Truman's argument in the Korean War. He wasn't sure that he was going to get a war powers declaration or a war declaration out of the Congress over this little brouhaha going on in Korea. And so he asked the United Nations to take on the job of opposing this invasion of South Korea. And the United Nations obliged, and Truman gave our forces to the United Nations Command, which doesn't then require the War Powers Resolution to be in effect. It later worked against him to not have a declaration of war because when he tried to take over the steel mills that were the subject of a major strike by executive order, the Supreme Court turned him down, saying that was an excessive use of presidential authority because you didn't have a declaration of war. Oops. Maybe I should have tried harder several years before. Huh? So, moving on. Why not just declare war and be done with it? Well, a declaration of war in itself creates a state of war under international law and eliminates and legitimates the killing of enemy combatants, the seizure of enemy property, and the apprehension of enemy aliens. How many have ever used the Congressional Research Service, CRS? You need to go to the CRS website and just put in any term, search term you're interested in. It is a wealth of good information. I use them all the time. They state further that as opposed to an authorization for use of military force, a declaration of war automatically triggers many standby statutory authorities conferring special powers on the President with respect to the military, foreign trade, transportation, communications, manufacturing, alien enemies, etc. Let's take a look at what are some of those things that automatically get triggered by a declaration of war. The Congressional Budget Act is effective. The National Emergencies Act is effective. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is effective. Selective Service Act is automatically turned on certain provisions. Alien Enemies Act. Armed forces, obviously, get affected by this. Unilateral trade sanctions. Certain statutes and limitations are affected by a declaration of war. Deferral of civil works projects automatically takes place when there's a declaration of war. Tort claims against the federal government. The one that surprised me was the Armed Forces Retirement Home. That gets triggered by a declaration of war. How many vets do we have in here? Okay, if you are wounded or injured in a conflict where there has been an official declaration of war, you are entitled to stay at the Armed Forces Retirement Home. If you are injured in some way in a hostility where there's no declaration of war, you are not entitled to take up the abode at the Armed Forces Retirement Home. So there's all sorts of things big things and little things that get put into motion if there's ever a declaration of war by Congress. Maybe that's one reason they are so reluctant to do so, because they know that this will be the effect. Were President Trump's recent actions grounds for impeachment?
No.
So says AOC, of course, but she has to stand in line because Al Green got there first in
He's always there.
putting his resolution on the floor. His got voted down, and hers certainly would have been as well.
I'm so glad he got booted.
And on the subject of impeachment, let's talk about Bill Clinton in 1999 sending troops to Kosovo without a war powers resolution and not pulling them out within 60 days,
Nobody did.
ignoring the 60-day limitation. Nobody called for impeachment at that time. Nobody called for impeachment of Barack Obama when he used B-2s and other aircraft to attack Libya without an AUMF.
That's right.
He asked for an AUMF to attack Syria in 2013. Congress didn't give it to him, so he sent troops in anyway. Nobody asked for impeachment. So let's put things in perspective, right? So in summary, as long as the War Powers Resolution remains in its present form, and I see nothing that's going to cause it to change, or until the Supreme Court is given an appropriately tailored case to adjudicate, the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution will forever remain unresolved. I hope you can see that now.
By design.
Yes.
Yep.
The best we can hope for is that future presidents are given a clear understanding of the history of the War Powers Resolution, its uses and abuses, and take seriously the responsibility to the people, the ultimate sovereign power in the United States. Are there any further questions?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, because the Supreme Court kind of rules in on this too, right?
Yep. Well, only when they have a case before them.
Okay, so they get a case, if they are partisan Supreme Court, in other words, not really going by the Constitution, because it seems like people gripe if it's on one foot and then they go on the other, especially if it's Democrats who don't have any, a lot of your more left organizations that are saying anything about it. They always go after Republicans. So is it the Supreme Court's, they're supposed to be unbiased.
Well, I'll take issue with your characterization of the court as partisan. We don't have a partisan Supreme Court. We do have a conservative Supreme Court.
Right now.
We have 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. And that is quite different than a partisan Supreme Court that rules based on party politics or party platforms. Yes.
I could only think of two individuals who, if they got elected to president, would address that issue.
And those two individuals are?
Rand Paul
Rand
and
Paul.
Thomas Massey.
Yep, okay, two good candidates.
Did they speak up when Obama did it?
They
I
could
don't know
have.
whether they were in the Congress when Obama did it. So, any other question?
Rand Paul.
Any other questions?
Witness father.
Yes.
You said in your opening part, you said that there were, World War II had 3 declarations of war.
Yes.
First being Japan, second being
Germany and Romania was also the subject of an official declaration of war. That surprised me too, to read that.
Wasn't there an issue with Grenada?
Well, Ronald Reagan sent forces into Grenada without an AUMF.
No aggression from them.
And so that's another controversy that can be discussed. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
In September of 2018, President Trump signed Executive Order 13848, which declares a national emergency. Okay, so are we still under that? Because in 2020, Trump also signed an Executive Order 13919 for continuity of government. Do you believe we're still in continuity of government?
I would have to look at both those executive orders, and I've actually read neither one of them. But I don't know how he characterized the emergency situation that in the first one? How did he characterize the emergency situation? What was the rationale for declaring an emergency? And so until we know that, we can't really make much of a judgment as to whether it was proper or not. Yes, in fact.
Just out of curiosity, do you know whether the Spanish-American War was conducted under a declaration of war?
The Spanish-American War of 1898 was conducted under a declaration of war. But in preparing for this, I write a almost weekly, a couple times a month, essay called Constitutional Minute for our Breakfast Club community over in the peninsula. And I did prepare one on the War Powers Act, or the War Powers issue. I'll send that to Waverly, and she can pass it on to all of you, because it does address that particular question. In 1898 was a threshold for the United States. Up until that point, we had never seen ourselves as a world power. But after the Spanish-American War concluded, and we forced Spain to give up its authority over Haiti, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Cuba, yes, thank you. We started looking at ourselves as a world power. The results of that, and I'm not making this up, there's several other commentators who have looked at this and come to the same conclusion. Our ability to conduct foreign affairs changed significantly after the Spanish-American War. We began to exert our influence in a much more positive and forceful way after the Spanish-American War.
Great White Fleet? Yeah.
So, take that as you will. It did have an effect on how we conduct foreign affairs. Any other questions? Yes?
Did you say that, as regarding the Supreme Court, that it has never been attempted successfully
The Supreme
at the
Court,
Supreme Court level, the War Powers Act?
I hope everyone realizes that the Supreme Court is prohibited from taking unilateral action.
They have to wait.
They have to wait patiently, frustratingly, and patiently until a case comes to them on appeal or meets the conditions in Article 3 for an original jurisdiction case before they can do anything.
And you say,
So it's up to the people to initiate a case and tailor it in such a way that they know it's going to be appealable up to through the Circuit Court of Appeals level and to the Supreme Court.
and even though it's appealable, maybe the Supreme Court
Doesn't have to
will
take
not.
it, yes.
They get to refuse it.
And unless the court sees, and I think they would in this case, unless the court sees some legal issue that they have been waiting for a long time to adjudicate, they can turn down any case they want. But I think if they were given a case concerning the War Powers Resolution, I think they would be very keen on taking that case to try to settle some of these ambiguities. But the case has to be structured exactly correctly, because the court can only render an opinion based on the question that has been presented to them in that case. Yes.
I wanted to ask also, the way that we have looks like it's pretty organized across the country. Foreigners being over here, instigating trouble, flying their flags, causing violence. Can this be used?
This is not an issue for the War Powers Resolution.
No.
Sorry. It is an important issue, and it's a troubling issue, but it's not in no ways connected to the President's war powers or the congressional. Well, there are different remedies for handling that situation. How about a last question?
So are we in limbo with this? I mean,
Yes, we are in limbo with the War Powers
is
Resolution.
it a constitutional crisis?
Whether it's a crisis or not, it is an open constitutional question.
Okay.
It's not a crisis unless the two opinions on this are so aggressively determined to make it a crisis. Right now, it's just an open question of whether it's
And
constitutional.
nobody's
or not.
touching it with a 10-foot pole.
And nobody wants to touch it with even a 30-foot pole.
There you go.
So think of it this way, it's a what-if question. We could what-if this all night long.
And yes, and people have been what-ifing this since 1972. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you.